Hey guys, what's up? It is your friendly neighborhood UberGoose here. I want to talk to you guys today about Resto Druid in 7.1.5, which we now know is releasing on January 10th, which means that's this Tuesday. That is 1 week before the Nighthold launch, and hopefully this video will give you everything you need to know going into Nighthold. So let's get right into it. First things first, I do want to add a little bit to my previous guide video, the hour 15-minute thing about 7.1 Resto Druid. First of all, worth noting, a lot of the stuff is pretty much the same as it's going to be in 7.1.5. So most of that is still good. However, there are a few things I actually missed / have learned since that I would like to share with you. First things first, when looking at trinkets, if it is a proc trinket, it pretty much needs to be doing at least 5% of your total healing. And unfortunately for proc trinkets, most of them do not scale pretty much with anything. They'll scale with versatility or to some degree with haste, so they proc more often, although most of them are RPPM, I think is what it's called, which basically means that they have a relatively set amount of procs per minute, so haste doesn't affect it too much. But basically, they don't scale with your gear, so as you improve, they get worse, and therefore stat stick trinkets are going to be a lot better in most cases. So if you can get your hands on the Ethereal Urn that drops from Nightbane, or Unstable Arcano Crystal, which drops from Withered Jim, the world boss, or even the Brinewater, I think it's called Brinewater Urn from Helya, any of those things are really, really good to get. So definitely be on the lookout for those. Obviously, World Quest trinkets also are stat sticks, so keep on the lookout for that. And other than that, the other thing you should really get your hands on is Drape of Shame. It is the cloak that drops off of Maiden in Return to Karazhan. And that's because it is insane. Pretty much no matter what, it's going to be your best in slot cloak. Even at 855 item level, it's going to be your best in slot cloak well into Nighthold and probably through Nighthold. So definitely get your hands on that thing. It's insane. The effect is makes all of your crit healing do 10% more, which is a substantial increase. And people have mathed it out. People who are more inclined to math and statistics than I have mathed it out to be at least 700 intellect worth of value from that effect. And because cloaks are pretty low on their stat budget, that actually makes the Drape of Shame on its own incredible. So get your hands on that, get yourself some stat stick trinkets, that sort of thing, and now let's talk about 7.1.5. So, first of all, as previously stated, Druid is pretty much the same, or at least Resto Druid is pretty much the same as it was in 7.1.0. However, there are a few minor changes which we will talk about here. One of the first minor changes is to the level 30 tier. Two little things got shifted around a little bit. Displacer Beast got very slightly nerfed. Still the same blink, still the same cooldown, all that stuff is the same. But instead of the sprint effect of 50% bonus move speed lasting 4 seconds, now it lasts 2 seconds. So, very slight nerf, doesn't affect much. It's still the mobility talent in the tier. It's still better than Wild Charge. You're still going to take it in any sort of fight where, the effect is useful. However, Renewal actually got buffed. So Renewal used to be a 2-minute cooldown, now it's a 1.5-minute cooldown. It's the same heal, but being on a 1.5-minute cooldown instead of 2 minutes is actually pretty big. That means a lot of raid fights you're going to get one more use out of this thing. Given that a lot of raid fights happen to be somewhere around the 6-minute mark in terms of duration. So that basically means in previously where you could use up to a maximum of 4 renewals in the fight, assuming you use one at the start and one every 2 minutes thereafter for 6 minutes, now you can use it 5 times instead of 4. So in a lot of fights, you're going to get one more use out of Renewal. Whether or not that pushes it over Displacer Beast is going to be dependent on the mobility requirements of the fight. But in any fight where there's not heavy mobility requirements, there's no one-shot mechanics if you're slightly too slow, that sort of thing. If it's more just constant incoming damage and you can get a lot of use out of Renewal, you're going to go with this for sure. And I'm definitely going to mess around with this when 715 drops on something like on Il'gynoth or even Guarm. It's probably really good. Fights like that. Then we have one little slight buff to Mass Entanglement. So instead of rooting people in place for 20 seconds, now it roots them in place for 30 seconds. And that basically means that it's the exact same spell, therefore it's dog shit. Moving on, we do have one more change to talents. Again, very minor. However, this one actually might make the difference. Moment of Clarity now makes it so when Omen of Clarity procs, you get 3 free regrowths, which is what it used to be. However, they also have an increase to their healing by 15%. And that includes the upfront heal as well as the heal over time effect. Now, in fairness, the heal over time effect is very low, but any increase is, beneficial. I think Moment of Clarity is going to be really, really good on fights that Flourish is not good on. And the reason that I say that is because on fights where Flourish is not good, you really don't go with Stonebark. You just, currently on live, you just still use Flourish and you find a use for it. But you maybe use it 2 times in 5 minutes or something like that, right? You don't use it on cooldown because there's not good enough damage. Like Il'gynoth, for example. Outside of popping large amounts of the Ichors on Mythic difficulty, there's really not great uses for Flourish because, it's really not a big deal, right? Most of the damage is spot healable. It's not raid-wide. And when it is raid-wide, it's in bursts, which is why Flourish is not that hot on that fight. It's still good, but it's not that great. Moment of Clarity is probably going to pull ahead in that sort of situation where it's a spot heal heavy fight and where Flourish is not too strong. So I love this change. I do think it could probably use a little bit more of a buff, just very slightly, but that's because I'm greedy and I want everything to be awesome. But Moment of Clarity is actually probably okay. It's going to take some testing for sure, but it is a lot of potential saved mana as well as potential extra healing, right? And you have to also take into account that Moment of Clarity means that you're going to increase the amount of regrowths you cast, which increases the value of crit because, you're casting more regrowths, which kind of benefit more from crit than most other things. It has a 40% increased crit chance, and also you have to understand that it also triggers, if we can scroll down to, what level do you get it here? 56. You also get Living Seed from it, which with your artifact traits stores about 50% of the heal. So there's a lot of value in Moment of Clarity, especially when you have Drape of Shame, right? You get to quadruple dip on things when you take Moment of Clarity. Now, whether that quadruple dipping is good enough, again, is going to depend on the fight. I think most of the time you're still going to roll with Flourish, though, so get used to it. Also, this thing is awesome anyway. Why would you not want to use Flourish? Beyond that, that's pretty much all the changes to Resto at its base level. I do want to talk about the legendary changes, so let's go over to those real quick. These are pretty huge. So first things first, I actually want to talk about the 2 new ones. So you have 8 that you can get right now on live, and then they're adding 2 more to every spec in 7.1.5. One of those is always going to be a trinket. Now, the first thing about these trinkets is that they're all stat sticks, and they all actually have variable primary stat, which means that they're usable by theoretically all specs. So, for example, if you're Guardian Druid and you got Archimonde's Hatred Reborn, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to reroll to Resto. Well, the good news is that this is a stat stick trinket. It gives you intellect. Bad news is versatility mastery, take it or leave it. And then the active, obviously not too good, but worst case scenario, it is a high item level, poorly itemized stat stick trinket. Therefore, it can still be pretty good. So let's first of all talk about Velen's Future Sight. This is the healing trinket that is now, it is a new legendary. All healers can get this, and it's crazy strong. So first things first, obviously, stat stick, and it gives crit, haste, and mastery, which is the same as the Kill Jaden's Burning Wish, the DPS one, which is awesome for Resto Druid because we do want all of those stats, and we want them in relatively equal amounts for the most part. So already it looks great. And then you add the on-use effect. This has a 1 minute, 15-second cooldown, and the on-use increases all healing that you do by 15%, and half of your overhealing is then redistributed to up to 3 nearby injured allies. So basically it spreads the overhealing around, and this effect lasts 10 seconds. This is obviously insane for Resto Druid because 15% increased healing for 10 seconds on a 1 minute, 15-second cooldown is already really good, especially because as long as you delay Velen's Future Sight, it lines up with Essence of Ganir, which has a 1.5 minute cooldown. You just have to delay 15 seconds, which I think is worth it a lot of the time to at least synchronize those effects to get a lot of like burst healing. Obviously, it'll depend on the encounters, but it's definitely worth noting. And then obviously, if you like delay Flourish, you can also make Flourish line up with this, although that's less relevant because most of your stuff is only going to last 10 seconds anyway, or near 10 seconds anyway, so that's less of a big deal, mostly with Essence of Ganir. But yeah, so this effect is crazy because also Resto Druid does a lot of overhealing. That's kind of the biggest thing about Resto Druid, is trying to reduce your overhealing while increasing your effective healing, and that normally comes with practice. That comes with kind of playing with your raid team, figuring out how they spot heal and stuff like that, and figuring out when you should be using Rejuve or when you should not be using Rejuve or Wild Growth or whatever. However, this allows you to get sloppy and just keep overhealing like crazy because half of it is going to just be spread, which is awesome. That means in like heavy damage situations where you need to be popping Tranquility, however, not everybody is going to be low. In fact, some people, in my experience, there's a lot of times where people are actually going to have like nearly full health, even in the situations where you're popping Tranquility. In those sort of situations, this is really strong because not only is it making Tranquility heal for 15% more, which is already really good, but everybody who's at full health is actually going to help your Tranquility heal the people who need the healing. So that's crazy, right? I think this trinket is like probably best in slot. I haven't done any testing, so take it with a grain of salt. This is definitely some thought crafting, less than theory crafting. But the general consensus is that all of these trinkets are pretty strong. The DPS one obviously is fairly spec dependent, and then the tank one is mostly just because tanks don't get good trinkets. But the healing one, definitely a lot of people are agreeing that it is quite strong. So definitely keep an eye out for this. I would use it if I got it. I'll probably never get it, though. The other new one that we get as a Resto Druid is Zoni's Caress. This is a glove slot legendary, gives haste and then mastery. And the equip effect is allies protected. Here, let me scroll down. Sorry, I realized that was slightly cut off. Allies protected by your Iron Bark also receive 75% of the healing from each of your active rejuvenations. Also worth noting, because you're always going to be using this on the tank is also going to have some amount of your mastery, increasing the healing effect of this on them, right? Because you're going to have hots on tanks at all times, right? Especially one that you're iron barking. If you don't have hots on the tank that you're iron barking, then there's probably something else that's going on, right? You're probably fucking up somewhere else. So the chances are you're going to have somewhere around 3 hots on the tank, and then they're going to receive 3/4 of all of your rejuves that are currently out for the duration of Iron Bark, which is 12 seconds, as well as damage they take is reduced by like 30% or something, depending on artifact traits and stuff, relics, that sort of thing. And like, this is just crazy, right? This is super strong in any situation where you need heavy tank healing, and heavy tank healing, normally the way that healing goes across expansions is at the start of the expansion, healing is pretty slow, not very spiky, you have a lot of time to react, you have a lot of planning that you can do, that sort of thing, and tank damage is relatively low. Obviously, if they mess up mechanics, they just die, but if they don't mess up mechanics, you can kind of just toss some hots on them every now and then, keep life bloom up, keep rejuve up, don't worry about them too much, that sort of thing. And then near the end of the expansion, damage gets way more spiky and way more like tank focused a lot of the time. So I do think Zoni's Caress is going to gain power throughout the expansion relative to the damage that people are taking. So I think that's good. It's also probably pretty strong right now. In 5-man content, this is obviously insane because pretty much all the damage being taken is on your tank. However, you're also going to have a lot of rejuves out. Minimum, you should be having 5 rejuves out in a heavy damage situation in Mythic Plus, and maximum, of course, could be 10. In the event of having 10 rejuves out, when you Iron Bark your tank, they're just going to be full health, right? They can never move away from full health for the duration of Iron Bark in that sort of situation. So definitely keep an eye out for this. If you get it, I would use the hell out of it. Maybe not so much in raids, that would depend on the fight, that sort of thing, but very strong legendary. And Edgewraith was unchanged as far as I understand, same with Dark Titan's Advice and Aman'Thul's Wisdom. Tearstone of Loon also unchanged, Essence of Infusion also unchanged. Echo Wraith got slightly buffed, so now your passives get a 75% bonus instead of 50%, which is a pretty good bonus, right? But it's not going to blow the doors off. You're just going to still use this if you have it, and if you have something better, you're going to use that instead. It's not a huge deal. A buff is a buff, and we'll take anything we can get. And then we have Cephas' Secret, which I, of course, have. My first legendary was Essence of Infusion, second was Pride-Az, third was Cephas' Secret. Well, the good news is there's only 2 more bad legendaries I can get, so, I'm golden. But Cephas' Secret actually got buffed quite substantially here. First of all, I want to talk about how jewelry has been affected. Obviously, I said Tearstone was unchanged, however, it did technically get buffed. Jewelry got changed in 7.1.5 to basically scale better with item level than it did previously. So previously, if you were looking at 2 rings with a difference of 50 item levels, you were only looking at like a handful of secondary stats. Normally not enough to even overtake if the higher item level one was bad stats and the lower level one was ideal stats. The lower level one generally would beat out the higher level one, depending on spec, depending on a variety of stuff. For Resto Druids, we generally went with item level, unless versatility was one of the stats on the ring. But now, we pretty much always go with item level, because, again, like I said, they scale way better. Item level on jewelry is almost always going to be king. The main difference is going to be 5 or 10 item level jumps, and in those situations, us as Resto Druids probably shouldn't worry about that. It's not a huge deal, don't worry about it. Cephas' Secret, though, like I said, got buffed because it's jewelry, so it has more secondary stats, and also, now the effect is 10% more haste, so instead of 15% haste for 10 seconds when you trigger the effect on a 30-second cooldown, now it's 25% haste, which is obviously substantial. That's a pretty big buff. And here's the bigger one. Now, instead of it just triggering on loss of control effect, it also triggers on interrupt, which we can't do, so who cares, but also dispelling any target. We can dispel. That's the thing we can do. That's a real good thing we can do. So on fights where you're going to be dispelling a lot, at least one time every 30 seconds, Cephas' Secret is going to be bananas. And it also gives crit haste, which are great stats, and obviously it has a socket. So having the 33% uptime on 25% haste is really good, right? That's really, really strong. So any sort of fight where you can keep that uptime, Cephas' Secret is going to be very good. In raids right now, that pretty much is just Helya, and I'm not certain about Nighthold. I haven't looked too in-depth into the bosses. I know general ideas behind most of them. But it is pretty niche in raids right now. However, I think in Mythic Plus, you probably want to run this. I think in Mythic Plus, if you have a choice between all of the legendaries, I think in Mythic Plus you probably want to run Cephas' Secret plus the Zoni's Caress, the new one, right? This one. I think that would be the pair that you'd want to run for Mythic Plus for the most part. So, yeah, big buffs, awesome changes, love it. Pride-Az is the last one that we have to talk about. Obviously, it has the same benefit as Cephas' Secret in that it is jewelry, so it just has more stats now. However, Pride-Az also just has more stats now than other jewelry, arbitrarily, because I guess they thought that people hated Pride-Az too much. So now, instead of it just being crit and mastery, it is now crit, haste, and mastery, not triple or not 50% more stats, somewhere around 10 to 15% more stats than another neck at the same level, but still an increase nonetheless in secondary stats compared to other things of the same level, which basically means that even DPS are going to actually want Pride-Az, assuming that, they're going to use Pride-Az, right? How about that? Still has the socket, and now the effect got buffed, so instead of it, first of all, requiring a 5-second delay of you not taking damage, now it just happens every 30 seconds. You always get the shield every 30 seconds. And also, it now absorbs 25% of your max health instead of 15%, which is, again, a pretty big buff. Pretty much the same buff as Cephas' Secret. And That's huge. I think Pride As is really good, and I'm actually really happy I have Pride As. If I do not get one of the if I do not get Tearstone of Elune or Velen's Future Sight, is that the name of it? Yeah, Velen's Future Sight. If I don't get one of those two going into Nighthold, I'm going to happily use Pride As and Essence of Infusion because, again, Pride As got buffed. Even without this buff, right, on my current logs, Pride As can be anywhere between like 2 and 5% of my total healing, which is huge, right? That's huge. And this is getting buffed anyway, so like that's crazy. I think Pride As is really, really strong, especially after 715. So that's all the legendaries. Most of the rankings have not changed much. The two new ones are very strong. They're near the top. Pride As probably has moved up a few notches. Seven's Secret has definitely moved up from the bottom. But for the most part, most of the standings are pretty much the same. Beyond that, we have a couple more things to talk about. Let's talk about the Nighthold trinkets first. This is going to be pretty brief, but these are basically the 4 trinkets that we have available to us in Nighthold. So the first one is Perfectly Preserved Cake. This drops off of Trilliax in the first wing of the Nighthold. He's like the 3rd boss or something. Pretty bad. It is a trinket that gives mastery, and then on use, you get to put out a magical feast, which allows up to 5 allies to eat, the feast, which I'm assuming it works like the Lightwell used to, where you have to right-click it. Maybe you just have to run over it. I do not know. Regardless, it requires people to actively do a thing to get this shield, and the shield is for, at base level, 225,000 absorb shield for 12 seconds. On a 2-minute cooldown is pretty weak, right? That effect is pretty weak. That means that every 2 minutes, assuming best case scenario, you're going to get 1.25 million healing, right? Every 2 minutes, which that's pretty low. That's like a pretty low HPS. Obviously, it's probably strong if you're trying to like cheese a mechanic, if you just need that much more absorb, if there's somebody who's like under geared and they don't have enough stamina to survive a thing, stuff like that, it could be okay, but it's pretty weak. You're better off, almost certainly better off using Unstable Arcano Crystal than the base level Perfectly Preserved Cake. In fact, Arcano Crystal is probably better than like any of the cakes, any eye level cake. The cake is pretty weak, so definitely unfortunate. We also have Illyriel's Mirror, which is, I think, okay. People are saying it's bad, and I haven't done testing with it, but pretty much nobody has, so we'll have to see. Again, it'll depend, just like other proc trinkets. It doesn't really scale with your gear, so as you improve in gear, it's going to get worse relatively, so that is worth noting. However, it does give haste, which is still a really good stat. And then the proc effect is your healing spells have a chance to grant the target Nightwell Tranquility, restoring some amount of health over 12 seconds, and then healing an ally who has Nightwell Tranquility can cause the effect to detonate, healing nearby allies for about half the amount, right? Half the amount of the heal over time. So, as far as I understand, applying the hot as well as blowing it up can all happen with Arhats, which is pretty good, right? That means that this happens quite frequently. Apparently the proc rate is somewhere around, what was the number I read? Oh, fuck, I don't remember. Was it like 3 per minute? I don't remember. God, I don't actually remember. I can't pull it up now. Oh, well, the proc rate's like fine, right? It's like a fine proc rate, and it does proc off of all of our healing spells, and it's okay, right? Again, it'll depend on how much of your total healing it does, whether or not it's good for you. But I could definitely see this one being a pretty strong proc trinket, just given the fact that if you put a rejuve on somebody, just one rejuve on one person, there's like a non-zero chance that they'll get the extra heal over time effect and also detonate, right? And that's pretty good. Then we have Atreus's Celestial Map, which is actually a strong trinket. Reason being, it gives you intellect, and your healing spells have a chance to give you a bunch of a secondary stat, either mastery, haste, or crit, which again, all 3 are great, all 3 are awesome, and as long as the proc rate is high, as long as it's like on par or hopefully higher, than Heightened Senses, there's a good chance that this trinket will be very strong, right? Simply because it gives main stat as well as secondary stats on proc. That's pretty good. And then Ephemeral Paradox is pretty bad for Resto Druid. This triggers off of only Healing Touch. So all of your healing spells have a chance to make your next Healing Touch restore pretty much a very low amount of mana instead of costing mana, which is fine. It does give int, so if you have a high item level 1, sure, roll with it. But Resto Druid doesn't really need mana trinkets, so it's not a huge deal either way. I would really recommend sticking with like other trinkets, trying to get Titan Forged trinkets to be higher than Nighthold ones. However, if you have to use Nighthold ones, I think it's pretty clear that the Celestial Map and Alluriel's Mirror are the top two. So that's pretty much it. I don't believe there's any others. I'm pretty sure there's just all 4 that can drop for heal spec. You could theoretically get some other ones that drop for DPS spec, and they could theoretically be good for you as heal spec as long as you're throwing out damaging spells, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. We'll figure that out if it becomes really egregious and that sort of thing. Finally, let us talk about the tier set. So first things first, the tier pieces, I think there's only one that has, so only the legs actually have really good stats on them, and that is crit haste. Everything else has at least one of our good stats. Obviously, we only have one not so good stat, and that's versatility. And first things first, let's clarify, you do want 4 set, and I'll explain why. And also, you're not going to grab the cape. So basically, you're not taking cape because Drape of Shame exists. You are wanting to go for 4 set, which basically means you are excluding either gloves or chest, and that's just going to depend on which one you get to drop. Head, legs, and shoulders are all quite strong because they give the not mastery stats, and also they're pretty good stat budgets. Chest is probably better than gloves, but this could also depend on your legendary situation. So let's talk about the set bonuses, though. The 2 set is very strong. Wild Growth grants you 4,000 mastery for 7 seconds. Wild Growth, the heal over time effect, lasts 7 seconds, which basically means that you're getting this mastery bonus for the duration of Wild Growth. Obviously, you're not extending this bonus with Flourish like you can extend Wild Growth. And if you do have Flourish and the 2 set, this will even more incentivize you to flourish earlier rather than later, so then you get the bigger ticks with the bonus from mastery to give you a relatively, or I guess an absolutely higher amount of healing if you have the 2 set and flourish. So if you do get 2 set, which hopefully you do, it's pretty important, then you should definitely be, using Flourish at the start of Wild Growth, pretty much immediately after casting Wild Growth, rather than waiting a little bit of time. So yeah, the 2 set's really good, and the thing is, on live, 4,000 mastery is like 6.85% mastery. That will change once 7.1.5 hits. Secondary stats are all slightly harder to get. I'm having trouble finding the information for Resto Druid specifically to find out how much percent, how much percent mastery we get per rating now in 7.1.5. But assuming it got slightly nerfed, this is going to give you somewhere around 6 to 6.5% mastery, right? Which is pretty strong. That means that all of your heal over time effects, just singular heal over time effects for the duration of Wild Growth, will heal for 6.5% more. And if you have multiple hots, that means you're double dipping, and it just gets better and better. So very strong 2 set for sure. The 4 set, also quite strong. This will depend on a lot of factors, in fairness, so it's really hard to kind of predict. But the 4 set bonus is each time your rejuvenation heals a target, it has a 1.5% chance to jump to a new target at full duration. This just creates a new rejuve. It does not remove the one that is jumping. It just creates a new one. So very, very strong effect. I believe this was on like tier 11 or something like that at a 2% rate, and apparently it was insane at that point. And it initially was a 2% rate for tier 19, but they've slightly nerfed it, probably because it was too strong. Actually, a pretty hefty nerf, took a quarter off the chance. But yeah, it's definitely strong. because it increases the value of mastery, because it just means you have more hots out, which therefore increases the value of the 2-set bonus, so it kind of creates this feedback loop of awesomeness. And it's also just really good. Having more rejuves is really good, especially if you're running with cultivation, especially if you have the new legendary Zoni's Caress, especially if you are playing a Resto Druid, because then more rejuves means you get more healing from Dreamwalker when you cast Wild Growth, which gives you mastery, which increases the healing of rejuve as well as Wild Growth. It's amazing, right? Like it's just awesome, and it also increases the value of haste when you get the 4-set, because it means that rejuve will tick more. More ticks means more chances to jump. And if you math it out, I'm actually gonna pull this up. I wasn't gonna pull anything new up, but I'm gonna pull this up for the sake of illustration. So let's go look at what would be a good fight for rejuve in Emerald Nightmare. Like Xavius? No, Cenarius. Mythic Cenarius would be a really good one, I think. So let's look at one of my Mythic Cenarius logs. Let's look at the best one, because I'm fucking awesome in that one. So in Mythic Cenarius, I will tell you in a second how many ticks of rejuve occurred in Mythic Cenarius, so you can figure out how many free rejuves you'll get in a fight. And obviously, there will be a little bit of a Russian doll effect, where a new rejuve can also trigger the effect. So it is theoretically possible that you could cast one rejuve and then have 20 out before the duration of the first ends without casting any additional. However, that's not going to happen, but theoretically possible. So I had on this Mythic Cenarius Parse 4-minute, 14-second kill, cast 55 rejuves, and rejuve ticked 594 times. So if we just round that up to 600, and then of course 1.5% of that is going to be, 9? So 9 free rejuvenations over the course of a 4-minute 14 fight. Obviously there's a lot more rejuves in a Cenarius fight than, a lot of others, because it has higher value in that fight, but still, that's a lot. 9 free rejuves in a raid fight is a huge amount of rejuves, right? So that is definitely worth noting. And again, if you have more haste than me, which there's a good chance you do, because my haste is relatively low at this current moment, I only have 18%. More haste you get means more ticks, which means more rejuves, and yeah. So definitely try and get the 4-set. Definitely get the 2-set. This is super important. And other than that, like I said, you don't want the cloak because you have Drape of Shame, and also versatility haste is like pretty bad. You do want the shoulders, legs, and head, and then between these two is just going to depend on luck of drops and legendaries and that sort of thing. But that's pretty much it. That's pretty much everything you need to know for patch 7.1.5 for Restoration Druid. I don't really play anything else right now. That's pretty much my main. I mean, I'm lying a little bit. I do have an alt Frost Mage that is 877, but I'm not that versed in Frost Mage to give you information about 7.1.5. I would recommend instead looking at the various resources for Frost Mage if you're interested, that are available on like Altered Time, which is a website devoted to mages. You could also, there was a video put out, I think just the other day, by Method about all of the mage changes in 7.1.5. Basically what I'm saying is I'm a Resto Druid guy. Other resources exist for other classes and specs. Look into it. I promise they're just as good as me. In fact, probably better than me, because I'm only a 7 out of 7, 3 out of 3, or 7 out of 7 Mythic, 3 out of 3 Heroic Scrub. But that's the info that I got. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.